for hundreds of years. This simple piece of cloth, 14 feet long, worshipped by the faithful for centuries, puzzling scientists for decades, was at last due to go on public display this year.
Nobody was supposed to change his mind. That was the entire point of putting him on the team. In 1978, when a group of 33 scientists assembled the first comprehensive scientific examination of the most controversial relic in Christianity, they needed a photographer who had absolutely zero emotional investment in the outcome. No faith, no agenda, no attachment to Jesus Christ, the resurrection, or anything associated with either. They needed a lens, a pair of hands, and a brain that would document whatever was there without flinching or wishing. So they chose a Jewish man from Los Angeles who had never set foot in a church as a worshiper and had no intention of starting. His name was Barry Schwartz. He was 32 years old. He was one of the best technical photographers in America, and he walked into the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, fully expecting to spend 5 days photographing scientists as they proved once and for all that the most famous piece of cloth on Earth was a medieval fake. He did not prove that. Nobody on the team proved that, and what they found instead launched Schwartz into a 46-year investigation that cost him his skepticism, his certainty, and very nearly his sanity, because the evidence kept saying something his mind refused to accept. For 17 straight years after that examination, he held out. He resisted the data. He found reasons to doubt. He clung to one specific objection, one scientific detail about the blood on that cloth that he was convinced no one could answer. Then a phone rang in his house in 1995, and a dying Jewish blood chemist said one word that demolished every wall Schwartz had spent nearly 2 decades building. This is the story of what was on that cloth, what the science actually showed, and the single molecule that broke a man who had spent his entire adult life refusing to believe what he was looking at. Before you can understand why Schwartz's resistance matters, you need to understand what the Shroud of Turin actually is. Because most people think they know, and most people are wrong. It is a piece of linen measuring 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide. It bears a faint sepia-toned image of a man's body, front and back, as though the cloth had been draped lengthwise over a corpse with the head at the center point. Millions of Christians believe it wrapped the body of Jesus Christ after crucifixion. Skeptics have called it a medieval forgery for over a century. But here is the problem with calling it a forgery. Nobody can explain how it was made. Not the scientists who examined it in 1978, not the laboratories that have studied it since, not the modern researchers who have thrown lasers, electron microscopes, and advanced imaging software at it for decades. Whatever created the image on that linen, it isn't paint, it isn't dye, it isn't scorch, it isn't photography, and it isn't any technique that has ever been successfully replicated by any human being using any technology from any era in history. That's not a religious claim. That's a scientific one. And it's the reason Barry Schwartz couldn't walk away. The first crack in the wall appeared in 1898, 80 years before Schwartz ever touched the cloth. An amateur Italian photographer named Secondo Pia was granted rare permission to photograph the Shroud during a royal exhibition at the cathedral in Turin. Photography in 1898 was brutal. No digital screens, no instant previews. Pia hauled a camera the size of a suitcase onto scaffolding, used violent magnesium flashes, and exposed 2 massive glass plates. Late that night, alone in his darkroom, Pia lowered a plate into developing chemicals, and as the image materialized on the glass, he nearly dropped it. On a photographic negative, everything reverses. Light becomes dark, dark becomes light, faces become hollow, distorted, flat. That's the fundamental rule. The Shroud broke it. What appeared on Pia's negative was not a distortion. It was a portrait. A sharp, detailed, hauntingly realistic face, eyes gently closed, a broken nose, bruising along the right cheek, a mustache, and a forked beard. An expression of devastating calm on someone who had endured extreme suffering. The image on the cloth itself was already a negative. A negative of a negative produced a positive. And that positive image, hidden inside the tonal reversal for centuries, was anatomically accurate, proportionally correct, and detailed beyond anything any known artistic method can explain. Now ask the question that has haunted investigators for over a century. who, in the medieval world 800 years before photography existed, understood the concept of a photographic negative? Who could create a flawless, reversed image across 14 feet of linen without any way to see, test, or verify the result? The human eye cannot perceive the world in negative. The human brain cannot compose an image in reversed tonal values. No medieval artist had any reason to attempt this. No modern artist has ever replicated it. In 1976, 2 years before Schwartz joined the STURP team, Air Force physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper fed a photograph of the Shroud into a VP-8 image analyzer. The VP-8 was a Cold War device designed for NASA. It converts image brightness into three-dimensional terrain relief, built for mapping planetary surfaces from satellite data. Bright areas rise, dark areas sink, and it generates a topographic model. Jackson and Jumper had tested dozens of images before this: paintings, photographs, sketches, X-rays. Every single one produced meaningless distortion because in a normal image, brightness represents reflected light, not physical distance. The Shroud produced a perfect three-dimensional human body. Peter Schumacher, the engineer who actually built the VP-8, had never heard of the Shroud. No religious background, no stake in the outcome. He later said the results were unlike anything he had ever processed through the analyzer, before or since. A geometrically accurate form: nose, cheekbones, brow ridge, chest, crossed hands, legs, all contoured correctly and rotatable without distortion. Image intensity at every point corresponded precisely to the distance between the body and the cloth, not reflected light, distance. Three-dimensional spatial data encoded into ancient linen. In nearly 50 years since that test, no image, painted, photographed, or digitally generated, has ever reproduced this result. Not one. The STURP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, arrived in Turin in October 1978. 33 scientists from Los Alamos National Laboratory, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Air Force Academy. They were granted 120 continuous hours with the cloth, 5 days and 5 nights. Schwartz was there as the official documenting photographer. His job was to photograph every test, every sample location, every analysis, create the permanent visual record, stay objective, let the lens do its work. He tried to quit before the trip twice. He told the team leader he didn't understand why a Jewish man would want to involve himself with the most important relic in Christianity. A NASA imaging scientist named Don Lin looked at him and said 5 words that would define the rest of his life. God doesn't tell us in advance. Within the first hour of examining the cloth, Schwartz knew it wasn't a painting. No brush strokes, no pigment layers, no variation in thickness. Under magnification, the image appeared to be formed by discoloration of only the topmost fibers of the linen, affecting just the outermost 200 nanometers of the fiber surface. Thinner than a bacterium, no known painting or dyeing technique creates images that shallow. Paint and stain penetrate deeper through capillary action. The Shroud image sits on the very surface and goes no further. The STURP team ran X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet photography, and microchemical analysis on every square inch. When chemists John Heller and Alan Adler tested the reddish stains, they confirmed hemoglobin, albumin, and hemiporphyrin derivatives. Real blood, not paint, not ochre, not dye. They found serum halos, the pale rings that form when blood separates as it dries, invisible to the naked eye but revealed under ultraviolet light. Halos no medieval painter would think to reproduce because the phenomenon wasn't understood until modern forensic science. And here is a detail that eliminates every forgery theory in a single stroke. The blood was on the cloth before the image formed. Underneath the blood stains, there is no body image. None. Blood first, image second. Every artist in history paints the body first and adds blood on top. The Shroud does it backwards. That sequence alone eliminates painting, rubbing, printing, and every contact transfer method ever proposed. STURP's final report, released after 3 years of peer review, included a statement you almost never see in scientific literature. They concluded the image was that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It was not the product of an artist, but the question of how the image was produced remains a mystery. That was 1981. The mystery has not been solved since. Schwartz went home with the data and spent the next 17 years refusing to accept what it implied, not because the science was weak. The science was devastating. No pigments, no mechanism, three-dimensional encoding, blood deposited before image formation, properties no laboratory could replicate. Every test pointed in the same direction, and Schwartz knew it. But one thing stopped him, one detail he could not get past. The blood on the shroud was red. Old blood turns brown, eventually black, sometimes within hours, almost always within days. Every forensic scientist on Earth will tell you that ancient blood does not stay red. It oxidizes, hemoglobin degrades. The iron compounds shift from bright crimson to dark brown to near black over time. It is one of the most reliable markers in forensic chronology. The blood on the shroud was still red after what believers claimed was 2,000 years. Standing over that cloth in Turin, Schwartz had looked at his colleague and they'd both shaken their heads. Old blood doesn't stay red. It couldn't be real. Something was wrong. For 17 years, that single observation was the wall Schwartz hid behind. Every other piece of evidence could pile up as high as it wanted. The red blood didn't make sense, and as long as that didn't make sense, he didn't have to accept the rest. Mid-1995, Schwartz was home in Los Angeles when the phone rang. On the other end was Dr. Alan Adler, blood chemist, Western Connecticut State University, one of the world's leading authorities on porphyrins, the molecular structures at the heart of hemoglobin. Harvard-educated, also Jewish, also not interested in proving any Christian relic authentic. Adler had spent years analyzing the blood samples from the 1978 examination, and he had found the answer to the question that had kept Schwartz skeptical for nearly 2 decades. Adler told Schwartz that he had discovered abnormally high concentrations of bilirubin in the shroud's blood. Schwartz paused. He didn't immediately understand the significance. Adler explained. Bilirubin is a yellow-orange compound produced by the liver when it breaks down damaged red blood cells. Under normal circumstances, it circulates in small amounts, but under conditions of extreme, prolonged physical trauma, sustained beating, systematic torture, the liver floods the bloodstream with massive quantities of bilirubin as a stress response, a biochemical scream. And bilirubin does something extraordinary to blood chemistry. It binds to hemoglobin in a way that prevents normal oxidation. Regular blood turns brown and then black because hemoglobin oxidizes over time. But blood saturated with bilirubin resists that process. The binding is so stable that it preserves the red color not for years, not for decades, but indefinitely. The blood on the shroud was red not because it was fake, not because it was painted, but because the person it came from had been tortured so severely that his liver chemistry permanently altered the way the blood aged. The blood of a tortured man stays red forever, Schwartz described the moment years later. Every objection he had held for 17 years collapsed at once. The last wall fell. The final piece had come in and it fit perfectly. And it was the worst possible answer for a man who had built his entire position on that one remaining doubt. He accepted the evidence, and he did not convert. He remained Jewish for the rest of his life. In 1988, 10 years after the STIRP examination, 3 elite laboratories, the University of Arizona, the University of Oxford, and ETH Zurich, each received samples cut from the shroud. The results were published in Nature, 1260 to 1390 CE Medieval. Headlines everywhere, case closed. Except the sample came from a single corner of the cloth, the most handled edge in the shroud's entire history. The very corner that bishops and cardinals had gripped during public exhibitions for centuries, soaked in sweat, candle wax, incense smoke, and the oils of 1,000 hands. Raymond Rogers, a Los Alamos fellow and STIRP's lead chemist, initially called theories about a flawed sample ludicrous. He set out to disprove them. Then he examined the actual threads. The carbon-dated sample contained cotton fibers, Gossypium herbaceum, interwoven with the linen, cotton completely absent from the rest of the shroud. The sample was coated with plant gum containing alizarin dye from madder root, bonded with gum arabic, materials found nowhere else on the cloth. Medieval nuns, who repaired the shroud after a devastating fire in 1532, had expertly woven new threads into the original linen, dyed to match the aged color. The 3 most prestigious radiocarbon labs in the world had dated the repair patch, not the shroud. Rogers published his findings in Thermochimica Acta in January 2005. His vanillin analysis, measuring a compound that degrades in linen over centuries, showed the main shroud body had 0 vanillin remaining, consistent with cloth between 1,300 and 3,000 years old. The carbon-dated corner still retained vanillin, 2 different ages on the same cloth. And when French researcher Tristan Casabianca used Freedom of Information law in 2017 to pry 711 pages of raw data from the British Museum, data that had been locked away for 30 years, the numbers were devastating. The measurements were not statistically consistent. Different spots on the same tiny sample gave ages varying by 150 years. The overall agreement index was catastrophically low for a test claiming 95% confidence. The case was never closed, it was papered over by a headline. The nail wounds on the shroud are through the wrists, not the palms. Every crucifixion painting in history puts nails through the palms, but French surgeon Pierre Barbet proved in the 1930s that palm tissue cannot support a body's weight. Crucifixion required nailing through Desto's space, a gap between the wrist bones, and every time Barbet nailed through that spot in cadaver experiments, the median nerve was damaged and the thumb snapped violently inward against the palm. Look at the shroud. 4 fingers visible on each hand. The thumbs are tucked in, exactly what happens when a nail destroys the median nerve. No medieval artist knew this. The blood type on the shroud is AB, one of the rarest in the world, roughly 3% of the global population. That same blood type appears on a completely separate cloth called the Sudarium of Oviedo, kept in a cathedral in northern Spain, documented since at least 570 CE. 2 cloths, 2 countries, 2 separate custody chains, never stored together. Blood type AB on both. When researchers overlaid the stain patterns, they found 70 points of correspondence on the front and 50 on the back, matching nose dimensions, matching thorn puncture patterns on the back of the head. In 2015, geneticist Gianni Barcaccia published a study in Nature Scientific Reports analyzing DNA extracted from dust within the shroud's weave. The genetic fingerprints came from across the world. Haplogroups from Western Europe, the Middle East, East Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and East Asia. A forger in 14th century France could not have deposited biological traces from 5 continents, unless the cloth wasn't forged in France, unless it had traveled for centuries along the route historians have traced from Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople to Europe. And Italy's ENEA laboratory spent 5 years trying to replicate the image using excimer lasers. They achieved superficial coloration on tiny patches, but to reproduce the full body image, their calculations required a simultaneous energy pulse of 34 trillion watts, lasting less than a billionth of a second. No technology on Earth can produce that pulse. Barry Schwartz accepted the evidence in 1995. He did not accept Christianity. He never prayed to Jesus. He never entered a church as anything other than a researcher. He launched Shroud.com in January 1996, 5 years before Google existed, and built it into the world's largest archive of shroud research. Over 15 million visitors from more than 160 countries. In 2013, he delivered a TEDx talk at the Vatican, a Jewish photographer standing inside the walls of Catholicism's headquarters, telling an audience of believers that the most important relic in their faith was authentic, not because of his faith, because of the evidence. Despite his lack of faith, despite every reason he had to walk away, he told the audience that he truly believed God had chosen a Jewish man with no emotional attachment to Jesus, a total skeptic with a negative attitude, and put him on that team specifically because nobody could accuse him of wanting the result he got. Then he paused, smiled, and said the line that silenced the room. Isn't it funny how God always seems to pick a Jew to be the messenger? Barry Schwartz died on June 21, 2024. He was 77 years old. He never wavered. He never converted. A Jewish man who spent 46 years studying the most Christian relic in existence, broken not by faith, not by theology, not by pressure from believers, but by a molecule called bilirubin, a blood chemical produced by extreme torture that turns invisible suffering into a color you cannot ignore. The shroud sits today behind bulletproof glass in Turin, sealed in climate-controlled argon. It carries blood that is still red, an image no laboratory can explain. DNA from civilizations that have risen and fallen, pollen from a hillside near Jerusalem concentrated around the head, and the testimony written in molecules of a death so violent that the body's own chemistry recorded it permanently into the fibers. It doesn't need you to believe in it. It has been waiting 2,000 years. It can wait a little longer. After everything you've just heard, do you think the Shroud of Turin is real, or is there an explanation nobody has found yet? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want to be here when the next piece of evidence surfaces on this cloth, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this investigation is far from over.